Well, hey there, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual worship service from Heritage Church of Christ in Fort Worth, Texas. We are thrilled that you are tuned in, and we hope that you're staying safe in the midst of our ongoing community battle with COVID-19. You know, these last months, as we as a church have taken our services and our other programming entirely online, our church has been through a lot of transition and quite a learning curve adjusting to worship at home. I know some of you aren't used to going to church in your pajamas. Some of you have used Zoom and YouTube Live for the first time during this pandemic, and you have been so patient with us as we have experimented with some new formats and technologies along the way. We have all been required to make some adjustments, and I've even learned that I've got to adjust some things about the way that I speak when my audience is all watching from the comfort of their home. It's different speaking to you when you're sitting on your couch than it is when you're here in the room listening in person. But one of my favorite stories that's come out of all of this actually happened to a pastor friend of mine up in Oklahoma who was preaching a sermon, and as an illustration, he was telling a story about the Amazon Echo that he has set up at his house. Of course, you know the Echo is a smart speaker that you can interact with, and if you call it by its unique name, you can give it instructions to play music or check the weather and lots of other tasks that it can handle. Well, my friend in his sermon was telling about how with the Amazon Echo, he had once used that to order some toilet paper from Amazon. And when he preached this message, he actually said the command. He told the key word and the name of the Amazon Echo and used that command and told it to order some toilet paper. Well, the funny part was that there were families at home who were streaming the worship service through their televisions, and suddenly their Amazon Echo devices picked up on that command, and they were unknowingly placing orders all of a sudden from Amazon to get toilet paper. And it started this chain reaction. And what's interesting is my pastor friend had never considered that possibility when he was writing the sermon. But he was glad to find out that at least someone was paying attention, even if that someone was a machine. Now, we live in an amazing time when most of us, without leaving the couch, can turn off the lights, change the thermostat, and have dinner delivered just with the sound of our voice. Depending on the devices that you have, you can set it up so that Siri or Alexa or Google are always listening for your next request. And I'm sorry if I just activated your device. But in spite of all of these attentive devices around us, most people in our culture feel unheard. In our world, hardly anyone really listens to each other. And when it does look like someone is listening, chances are they're really just waiting for their turn to talk. Our culture has a listening problem. And that listening problem results in less understanding, less engagement, less closeness, and less trust. And that environment presents one of the greatest challenges ever for sharing the story of Jesus. And that's what we're talking about today and in our series that we're working our way through in the month of January. Today is part 2 of our Be the Spark series, and it's all about having a faith that radiates. Now, if you happen to be tuned in today and you're not a Christian, I want to invite you to stick around, because I'll bet that you have some stories or experiences with Christians whose faith didn't radiate. In fact, it actually repelled. And I want you to be here to hear about how we're trying to address that problem. But if you are a Christian listening to today's message, I hope you'll believe me when I say that today I have great news for you about sharing your faith. I realize that the prospect of sharing faith makes lots of Christians feel intimidated and even feel guilty. But today and throughout this series of messages, we're talking about steps you can take that won't scare you and they won't offend anybody around you. And best of all, I think the steps we're talking about are more likely to make a difference than some of the ways that you maybe have seen or been taught about in the past regarding how to share your faith. So last week, if you were with us for the first message in this series, you may remember that we talked about the essential first step to sharing your faith, which is prayer. And I want to say, I am so thankful to those of you who chose some specific people in your life who need to know Jesus, and you decided to pray for them. And some of you shared those names with me, and I would be thrilled to hear about even more of those so I can join you in prayer. I found myself praying for your friends this week as I was praying for those in my life that are on my list. But the reason that we begin with prayer is because the gospel is God's good news, and salvation is God's project. It's God who has the capability and the responsibility to draw hearts to himself. But God invites us to participate in this project, to embody hope and peace, to show the world what God can do. And one of the ways we can bless others well and change their lives for the better is to truly listen. Author David Augsburger has said that being heard is as close to being loved that for the average person they are almost indistinguishable, as if the average person just couldn't tell those apart. And that's why listening is the second tool in our evangelistic toolbox. Now, as we get started, I want to show you an underlying principle that applies here by taking you to look at a story that's recorded in the New Testament book of Acts. Now, when you look at the book of Acts, you're looking at an account of the activity of the very first generation of Christians, those who knew Jesus personally and were the followers who began the movement after Jesus ascended to heaven. We're looking at stories from the early church as it grew and expanded, and in particular, Acts tells stories of traveling missionaries who took the good news about Jesus to new cities and new towns near the eastern Mediterranean Sea. And one of the missionaries that features prominently in Acts is a man named Paul. Now, Paul, or maybe you've heard him referred to as Saint Paul, he had a Jewish background, like almost all the Christians at that time did. And so Paul's typical missionary strategy when he arrived in a new city was to find the local synagogue, which is where the Jewish immigrants gathered for worship. And he would talk to those Jewish people about Jesus. You see, the Jewish people were already familiar with the Old Testament and the prophecies about the Messiah. And so Jewish people were as likely as anyone to understand and believe the news as long as Paul connected the dots for them from the Jesus story. But by the time we get to Acts chapter 17, something unusual happened to Paul when he found himself alone with the equivalent of a travel layover in Athens, Greece. Now, you may know from your world history courses, Athens was a center for art and philosophy in the ancient world. In fact, we know it as the birthplace of democracy. Athens was a place where big ideas were formed and processed and discussed, and that included big ideas about the spiritual world. In fact, while Paul was in Athens, verse 17 of chapter 17 tells us that he was deeply distressed to find that the city of Athens was flooded with idols. Now, what's cool is, historically, we know about some of the idols that he likely encountered. We know that Athens is home to the Parthenon, a building whose ruins you can still visit today. And we know that that building was built as a temple to the Greek goddess Athena. And if you were to go and visit the Parthenon, then just a half mile away, you would also find the ancient temple of Zeus, which took over 600 years to build and was just over halfway finished when Paul visited that city. You could continue to tour around today in Athens and find other ancient temples and temple ruins. And there's one, even though it was dismantled in the 3rd century, that Paul would have probably seen. It was a place of worship that was called the Altar of the 12 Gods, and it was dedicated to the 12 gods of Olympus. And the reason that I care about all of this for the sake of this message, the reason this is so notable for us today, is because Paul, in this story, was about to interact with some people who had a completely different worldview and background than he did. Chapter 17, verse 17 says, he began to interact with the Jews and the Gentile God worshipers in the synagogue. Like we said, that's what he typically did. But then it says he also addressed whoever happened to be in the marketplace each day. And certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers engaged him in discussion too. Now, these were people who were spiritually and philosophically curious and educated, but they had no history with the Jewish scriptures and no familiarity with the prophecies about the Messiah. In a spiritual or religious sense, we're talking about people who spoke a completely different language than Paul. They didn't understand his message. And so verse 18 says, some of them said, what an amateur. What's he trying to say? And others remarked, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods. And they said this because he was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. And so it actually says they took him into custody and they brought him to the council on Mars Hill. This is at the Areopagus. This is a famous place for philosophical debate in Athens. And they asked him, what is this new teaching? Can we learn what you are talking about? You've told us some strange things, and we want to know what they mean. So what's happening here is that Paul's typical, usual methods aren't working because he's now speaking to a totally different audience. He's not just inserting the final piece of the puzzle into the story that people have already been working on like he typically did when he spoke to the Jewish people. He's talking to people with a completely different background, a completely different understanding. And so Paul had a decision to make. They put him on the spot in front of a whole council of philosophers, and they asked him to explain himself. And he could have started from the beginning and tried to explain the entire history of Israel. He could have gone through slavery and the Exodus and all of the divided kingdom and all of those different stories, but he chose a different approach based on what he had already learned about his listeners. Verse 22 says, Paul stood up in the middle of the council on Mars Hill and said, people of Athens, I see that you are very religious in every way. As I was walking through town and carefully observing your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. What you worship as unknown, I now proclaim to you, he says. And then, in the next 7 verses, Paul went on to preach a sermon unlike any he had ever preached before. It wasn't a sermon with references to Old Testament passages. It wasn't a sermon that required prior knowledge of Judaism to understand. His sermon met the Athenians right where they were and invited them into a story that answered some questions that they already had. And the story tells us that after Paul's short speech, several people in Athens Several people in the Areopagus, this famous philosophical debate location in Athens, several of those people became followers of Jesus. Now, we're not going to read Paul's sermon today, but here's what I want you to notice. I want you to see that even on short notice, Paul paid attention so that his message would bring relevant hope and clarity to his listeners. He didn't walk in and just pull out his stock sermon and expect the Greeks to adjust. He didn't try to attack their belief system, and he certainly didn't try to tell them why they had it all wrong. He approached them respectfully, kindly, gently, and he adjusted his approach in order to answer the questions that they were already asking. In fact, that became a hallmark of Paul's approach to ministry for the rest of his life. Later on, in another letter that we have recorded in the Bible in 1 Corinthians, Paul actually described this approach to ministry. He said, "When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I am with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law so that I can bring them to Christ. When I am with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some." And what Paul is saying here is that for the rest of his life, from that day in Athens when the Spirit led him and his circumstances drew him into a moment when he could speak to people that he had never spoken to before, from that moment on, he made it a priority to meet people spiritually exactly where they were. And if you're going to truly meet people where they are, and if you're going to walk with them on a spiritual journey, you've got to pay attention to what they share about themselves. You've got to become a spiritual listener. You know, it's kind of a running joke at my house that a visit from a door-to-door salesperson is one of my biggest pet peeves ever. I bought this sign that goes on the wall right next to the doorbell at our house, and the sign says, "No soliciting. Please don't come try to sell us anything." But that sign only deters a few of the salespeople that show up. And so every few weeks the doorbell rings, and I'll get up from whatever I was busy with or whatever I was interested in, and I'll find someone standing at my front porch trying to sell me something. It's usually a home security system. And I'm not shopping for a home security system. And if I was shopping for one, I would do it on my schedule, on my terms, and I would call a company that I knew to be reputable rather than buying from a stranger who showed up uninvited at my front door. And so every time as I'm standing there, I'm so frustrated because they ignored my sign. But more than that, I'm surprised. In fact, I'm flabbergasted that they would ask me to trust them to protect my home when I can't even trust them to honor a simple request like the one that I posted on the wall. Now, maybe they're legit, maybe they're selling a great product, but I don't trust what they're offering because they weren't willing to listen to me. But you know, I have to admit that at times I've approached people like that trying to convince them to follow Jesus. In my story, in my life, I've been part of campaigns where we walked around the state capitol building in Austin and we tried to initiate conversations about Jesus as if the people who were there on business didn't have anything else on their minds that day. I've been part of evangelism teams that spent whole afternoons at the mall in the food court trying to strike up conversation with shoppers about their eternal souls. I've even gone door to door in neighborhoods in my hometown trying to invite people to Bible study. And I'm not saying that those things are sinful, and I know we need to be serious about sharing our faith. But what I am saying is that I don't think those strategies come across as very respectful. I think they tend to make people feel like they're just projects to us. And it certainly doesn't make them feel heard. And when people feel like a project and when they don't feel heard, they typically aren't really receptive to what we have to say. But there is some good news. And the good news I want to share with you is that most people are willing and most people are interested to talk about spiritual matters with someone they trust. In fact, I found one published study from 2019, and it reported that 79% of unchurched people said they don't mind talking to a friend about faith. But the context of that willingness is important. The context of that willingness is inside a real friendship. It's not a blindside conversation. It's not a one-sided presentation. We're talking about a relationship. In fact, when Barna Group conducted a national survey, most people said they'd be willing to talk about spiritual matters with someone who listens to them without judgment and someone who allows them to draw their own conclusions without risking the relationship. In other words, people are willing to talk about faith if they know they're talking to a genuine friend. And I think that's a simple but profound lesson that you and I could learn a lot from. Todd Hunter, the former CEO of an international evangelistic ministry called Alpha USA, has said, I'm willing to bet the farm that our postmodern society, in this environment, the most important evangelistic skill is listening. And when you think about it, everybody loves to be listened to, right? Everybody loves when their voice matters to someone. Listening without treating a person as a project or treating the conversation like a competition, that kind of listening communicates something. It communicates interest and respect. It communicates value and importance. It communicates humility. And it communicates love. This year, in fact, last week, my family's health insurance changed for the new year. And so last week, I spent some time on the new carrier's website flipping through the doctor network because we're going to need to make a switch with one of our physicians this year. And when I found the names of the doctors in network, I made a list and then I started to search their names on Google so that I could get reviews about these doctors from their existing patients. Now, I don't know a whole lot about medical school or residency or different technical qualifications. I don't know what to look for when it comes to a doctor and all of their training background. But you know what always comes up and what always stands out in those doctor reviews? The good reviews always say, this doctor took the time to listen to me. And the bad reviews always say just the opposite. And you get it. If I go to see a doctor, I know they may need to tell me something hard or frightening or serious. They may, at some point, need to have a really important conversation and share some really important news with me. But if I don't think the doctor cares to listen to me, I'm not sure I'll ever really hear or trust what it is they're trying to say. You know, I believe the news that we as followers of Jesus are called to share, it's the greatest and the most important message ever. But I also believe that if non-believing people around us don't know that we're listening, if they don't believe that we care, if they can't tell that we love them without condition, our message probably won't get through. And so here's the challenge for you for this week. I want to ask you this week to commit to being a listener. I want you to ask God to show you how, and then make a real attempt to actually tune in to the stories and the voices and the concerns of the people in your life that don't share your faith. Now, there's a few things you'll have to do. You'll have to take time to reach out. You'll have to make time to make contact with some of the people in your life. And I know this is maybe particularly difficult during this time of quarantine and pandemic. But as you make contact, and it might be by text, it might be by phone call, it might be over social media, or it might be in person, you reach out and make contact with the people in your life that don't share your faith, and then you ask good questions. You ask questions about what they're going through, what they think about current events, what they're worried about, what they're excited about. And as they tell you the answers to those questions, number one, you've got to recognize that means something. They're entrusting you with an opinion or with some personal information, and it's a privilege. But when they share that information with you, I want to challenge you to hold your tongue. To not sit there and think about how you're going to respond or about your own story that you're going to tell after they get done telling their story. I want you to just listen. And as we continue to think about ways, as we continue to talk about strategies for sharing your faith, I want you to pray that God would help you see the connection between your friend's greatest needs, your friend's greatest anxieties, your friend's greatest wishes, and the great hope that exists because of Christ. I'm so excited about the potential that exists in the relationships that God has already placed in your life. I am so honored to be praying with you specifically for some of these people by name. And I'm looking forward to seeing how God uses us as we trust Him to work in our midst, and as we show up as listeners, people who care, people who are interested, and people who want to share the same kind of receptivity and love that was first given to us. As you go this week, let me offer a prayer for you that your encounters would be the kinds of connection with other people that show the love of Christ everywhere you go. Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much that you have not only worked in the lives and the hearts of so many of us, me and the others that are listening to this message, but Father, that you invite us to be a part of your redemptive work in the world. Father, it doesn't take just a few minutes of thinking about current events, the news, our own personal struggles and anxieties to realize that the world is a complicated, worrisome place. And we have a lot of people in our community, Father, who are facing that world, facing that news and that daily grind without the hope that is possible through Christ. Father, use us. Use us to be the kind of people that others see Jesus in. That others would see Jesus in the way that we engage, in the way that we talk, in the way that we serve, in the way that we act, in the way that we live, and this week in the way that we listen. May we be quick to lend a caring ear, to listen to the stories of those who have not discovered your love yet. And as we hear their stories, may we respond with genuine love and compassion that leads them straight to you. We pray in Jesus' name, and amen. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope your week is fantastic, and I hope you'll join us again next Sunday. May God bless you.